Welcome to the NEJM Outbreaks Update. I'm Stephen Morrissey, managing editor of the journal, and I'm talking with Eric Rubin, editor-in-chief, and Lindsey Baden, deputy editor. Today we're joined by Yoshihiro Kawaoka. Yoshi trained as both a veterinarian and a virologist, which made him well-placed to study one of the early U.S. outbreaks of avian flu. Since then, he's done groundbreaking work in understanding H5N1 influenza and how it's transmitted between species. He's received many awards and is a member of the National Academy of Sciences and is a person of cultural merit in Japan. He's got a very long commute between his two positions as professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and at the University of Tokyo. Yoshi, thank you for joining us today. Let's start with a simple question. What exactly is H5N1 influenza and what defines avian flu?
H5N1 is a subtype of influenza A virus known for primarily infecting birds. It's called H5N1 because of two surface glycoproteins on the virus, hemagglutinin H and neuraminidase N. Avian flu refers to influenza viruses that circulate among birds. There are 19 H types and 11 N types. H5N1 is just one of them. They can sometimes cross species barriers and infect mammals, including humans, but are considered avian because birds are their natural host where they replicate most efficiently.
So, Yoshi, I often hear these described as HPAI, highly pathogenic avian influenza. What does the HPAI designation mean?
So that's a very good question because when we say highly pathogenic avian influenza viruses, that means highly pathogenic for poultry. So there are two kinds of avian influenza viruses in terms of pathogenicity. One group kills poultry like chickens and turkeys 100% experimentally. The other group replicates in chickens and turkeys, but they do not die. So those are low pathogenic avian influenza viruses.
So the current circulating avian flu is pathogenic in the poultry across the U.S. and has impacted the poultry in terms of bird die-offs and some of the egg challenges we hear about?
That is correct. What is unique is that now this highly pathogenic avian influenza viruses is in wild waterfowl. And so the virus is transmitted from wild waterfowl and migratory birds to poultry, and then chickens and turkeys get infected and die.
Currently, there are at least two different H5N1 strains circulating in the United States. What's the difference between the two?
These strains belong to different clades or subgroups within the H5N1 family, which means that their genetic makeup is slightly different. Some emerged in the previous outbreaks, and others, like the 2344B clade, started circulating more recently, often with broader geographic spread. Within the 2344B clade, two genetically slightly different viruses, genotype D11 and B313, are present in the United States. D11 viruses are mainly in birds, and B313 viruses are mainly in U.S. cattle.
During the current U.S. outbreak, there are multiple animal species that are being infected. Which species are at particular risk right now, and why is that?
Domestic poultry like chickens and turkeys are at high risk because they are highly susceptible. 100% of experimentally infected poultry die. Another notable animal species we need to consider is cattle. The avian flu outbreak in dairy cattle was identified at the beginning of 2024 in Texas. The virus spread from birds to cattle and then among cattle in 17 states, and it continues to circulate among cattle. This outbreak was caused by genotype B313 avian flu virus. Importantly, two separate introductions or transmission from birds to cattle of genotype D11 viruses occurred recently, one in Nevada and the other in Arizona. The sheer number of avian flu-infected cows also creates more opportunities for the virus to mutate and adapt in mammals. Also, the spread of avian flu virus to cats that are exposed to virus containing milk and uncooked pet food is worrying. The concern with cat infection is that they are close to humans.
Yoshi, what happens to infected cats?
So cats are highly susceptible. Usually the virus replicates systemic organs and the virus goes to the brain, and usually they show neurologic symptoms.
I know we're going to be talking more about interspecies transmission, but has there been transmission between cats and humans in the past?
Yes. So virus-infected chickens have been fed to lions and other large animals, cats, and they get infected and died in the past.
So as you're suggesting, we often think of epidemic flu as an animal disease that can cross over into the human population. What determines whether a particular strain can make that jump and then, furthermore, transmit between humans?
We do not completely understand what is needed for avian flu viruses to circulate efficiently in humans, but over the years, we learned a lot. The avian flu and human flu viruses differ in their recognition of receptors, that is, the cell surface molecules to which the virus binds to get into cells. Mutations in the hemagglutinin, a protein on the surface of virus particles, need to be acquired by avian flu viruses for them to efficiently bind to receptors present on the surface of human respiratory organs. Additional mutations in the viral polymerase proteins, which make copies of the viral genome, also help avian flu viruses to grow better in human cells. Yet, more mutations will be needed for avian flu viruses to be highly transmissible in humans. But currently, we do not know what those mutations are or in which virus proteins they might occur.
Yoshi, you've studied many avian flu outbreaks in the past. How is this one the same, and how is it different?
So I've been studying highly pathogenic avian influenza viruses since 1983 when I came to the United States as a postdoc. And at that time, the virus was not transmitting from birds to humans. Many people went into chicken farms culling infected chickens. Nobody got infected. But now, more recently, the virus is different, clearly different. The virus can infect mammalian species better. We don't know exactly why, but certainly recent H5N1 viruses are different in that sense.
Yoshi, my understanding from the current H5N1 strains that are circulating, that some of the genome, and the flu genome, I think, has 8 segments that can recombine. One of those segments, the PB2, has mutations that facilitate mammalian replication. Is that correct? And is that perhaps an element that has increased the pathogenicity of the current circulating strains?
So in the past, there are avian influenza viruses that are in migratory waterfowl acquired mutations in PB2 proteins that make the virus replicate better in mammalian species. But at the moment, the one that's circulating in avian viruses in the United States, they do not have such mutations. What is happening is once the avian influenza viruses are introduced into mammalian species like cattle, then they acquire mutations in the PB2 proteins that make the virus replicate better in mammalian species.
I don't think that there's been a cattle outbreak of this magnitude in the U.S. before. Has this occurred in other countries, Yoshi?
So there have been some reports describing infection of cattle with the avian influenza viruses, but there have been no sustained transmission of influenza viruses in cattle in the past.
And Yoshi, there have been 70, 80 documented episodes of human infection in the US, most of which have been conjunctivitis or mild illness. However, at least 2 cases were quite severe, with one being a fatality. My understanding is those 2 cases were the D11 variant as opposed to the B313. Are there certain features? Is this chance, or are there certain features of this genotype that makes it more pathogenic potentially?
Some suspect D11 may be more pathogenic than B313 viruses, but I don't think we have enough information to say that. At least in the animal model, we don't see much difference in terms of pathogenicity between the 2 genotype of viruses.
Yoshi, you studied methods to limit human exposure to influenza through, for example, pasteurization of infected milk. What have you learned, and what should we be doing?
So standard pasteurization is sufficient to inactivate influenza viruses, including H5N1 virus, in milk or other dairy products. Proper cooking of poultry and eggs also inactivates the virus. These findings emphasize how important food safety practices are in reducing exposure to virus, especially when outbreaks are ongoing in animal populations. So pasteurizing dairy products, cooking poultry thoroughly, and maintaining good hygiene are important for minimizing the risk of virus transmission to humans.
Yoshi, do we know the routes of exposure in the cases that we've seen in humans thus far?
So in the cattle cases, in the infection of humans in cattle farms, they usually get the exposure to eyes, so they get conjunctivitis. Not many humans who got infected with cattle viruses show respiratory symptoms.
And how about GI or oral exposures? It sounds as if, from your description, that the cats that have been infected presumably from ingesting contaminated milk. Is drinking contaminated milk a real risk when it comes to humans as well?
Oh, I think so. Experimentally, there are several papers, including ours, showing that when we put the virus-containing milk into your mouth, orally infecting, they get infected and die. So certainly drinking the virus-containing milk is a concern.
And do you think in the animal models that you've studied, is that likely to be through an oral mucosal route, or is it through an airway, through aerosolization of some of the ingested milk?
I think the oral ingestion will expose the back of the throat, and of course that is sufficient to initiate the virus infection.
So, Yoshi, you're highlighting the risks from animal reservoir spillover into the human population or other mammalian species like cattle as well. In terms of methods to control the outbreak and the spread in the zoonotic reservoirs, how well does culling infected poultry farms work in being able to decrease these risks when a flock gets infected?
Certainly, if you cull all the infected poultry or surrounding, certainly the culling the infected poultry eliminate the source of the infection, and therefore you reduce the risk of spread of the virus. But there's some cost.
So, Yoshi, vaccines have been developed for poultry. Where do they stand in their potential delivery and utilization to try and control this in that reservoir population?
So the vaccine for poultry highly pathogenic influenza virus has been approved, but that does not mean the use of that vaccine is approved. So that needs to be further discussed. In other countries like China, they have used poultry vaccines for highly pathogenic avian influenza viruses effectively. They had a major outbreaks of highly pathogenic H5N1 viruses, and they used the vaccine and they controlled and reduced the human infections. So there is some precedent, but there is a cost because you may not be able to export your poultry products.
Have the vaccines been tested and used in cattle as well?
So the vaccine for cattle is being developed, and it's been reported that the vaccine induces good immune responses.
So, Yoshi, as I think about how this pandemic in the fowl affects us, given the profound impact in the avian population, is highly pathogenic avian influenza contributing to scarcity of eggs?
I'm sure everyone knows when you go to supermarket, the egg price is high. And you also notice that on the shelf, the eggs are gone. So I don't know whether you all go to a supermarket yourself or not, but you notice that. So that is actually happening right now. And also that happened before. So certainly we need to do something.
The price of chicken hasn't gone up the way that the price of eggs has. Why is that? I mean, chicken is maybe a little more expensive, but it's easy to get chicken, hard to get eggs.
Good question. I don't know why, but I think we are talking about laying chickens versus the broiler, which is the meat chicken.
Are they raised differently? Is there a reason that there's less culling going on among broilers? I guess they don't live that long, right?
Yeah, 60 days.
60 days. Okay. All right. The laying hens live for a long time. Well, let me ask a less inflammatory question. You've talked about the highly pathogenic viruses, which are defined as their virulence in birds. And you talked about how they are also highly virulent in some other species like cats. What about the cattle? Are they getting sick? Are they evidently sick from these viruses?
So it depends. In the beginning, we are not hearing much of death. You also hear that 2% to 5% of the mortality in some farms. So it's not benign.
And the economic effects, is there decreased milk production in the sick cows?
Certainly, you see low quality of milk. Also, the production drops, but will come back. But we are not ready to say whether they will come back 100% or not.
And for how long do infected cattle shed virus in the milk?
Like 2 weeks. But also, the virus is shed in milk before animals showing symptoms.
And can cows be infected multiple times, or do they develop immunity?
So USDA recently performed an experiment, and they showed that when the animals are infected first and then reinfected with the same virus, they show no symptoms.
Yoshi, endemic flu in humans is a seasonal disease. Is avian flu similarly seasonal?
In the past, it was seasonal, but that was mainly because in winter, the virus survived better in the environment. But that's not happening anymore. I think we are seeing avian influenza outbreak quite often in January, even summer.
Might that be related to just such the overwhelming infection in so many birds?
That is also the case. And also, there's a spillover from cattle to chickens in the United States.
And that spillover, is that direct infection of chickens by cattle on the same farm, or is there some intermediate host?
Intermediate host is humans. So humans are transmitting virus from cattle farm to chicken farms.
I want to know how it affects the price of beef. No.
I do have that question, though. What about beef cattle? You hear about dairy cattle all the time, but what's going on in the beef herds?
That's a great question, because what's happening in cattle is the virus is replicated in mammary gland, not in respiratory organs. So the beef cattle are not affected.
Ah, interesting. Yoshi, that was super interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Yoshi, for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
And as always, thank you, Eric. Thank you, Lindsey.